Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the history of Germany 1918 to 45 for A-level history. I'm looking now at resistance within the German army to Adolf Hitler. Really talking about the officers' ranks. Ordinary soldiers were in a little position to resist, couldn't command others to do this or that. So the officers were mainly recruited from the upper class, and most of them had a broadly conservative outlook. Many of them had been willing to cooperate with the Nazis in the early years, and they had shared some of the goals of the Nazi Party, which was to say annulling the Treaty of Versailles, regaining some territory in the east from Poland, and beefing up the armed forces, preventing the Communist Party coming to power, things of that nature. Now, in 1938, a few officers plotted against Hitler already. They felt that he was spending too much in the military, he'd removed civil liberties too much, and he was bringing them towards another war, which they might well lose. So you should read the memoirs of Peter Ustinov, that British actor, and his father had been a German army officer in the First World War. They're living in London in 1938, and Peter Ustinov was sent out for the evening by his father. He had some German generals there, some British Foreign Office officials, and they were trying to hatch a plot to overthrow Adolf Hitler. And they were urging France and the United Kingdom to stand firm in September 1938 to not agree to the Sudetenland becoming part of Germany. But anyway, France and the United Kingdom caved in. And the idea was being if they had stood firm, then there would have been a military coup against Hitler. Now, I don't buy it myself. I don't think Ustinov is lying, but I don't think it would have succeeded. I really don't believe that the army would have moved at one. Up until that point, in his own terms, Hitler was almost a complete success, had achieved so many of his objectives. And he was not unpopular. This is a war that they think they might be able to win. They felt that they had a fairly just cause in relation to the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia where a high majority of people were ethnically German, and most of them voted to rejoin Germany and all the rest of it. So relatively few army officers who wanted to oust him at that stage. But then 1944, it was a different situation. It was the July plot. Claus Graf von Schenk and Stauffenberg was the ringleader of the plot. He's just normally known as Stauffenberg. There's a museum of the German resistance in Berlin, and it's on Stauffenbergstrasse, as in to honor the brains behind the operation. Now, Stauffenberg had been badly wounded in the war. He'd lost some digits in his right hand. He'd only got one eye, so he felt he wouldn't be able to shoot Hitler with his left hand. Drawing a revolver and leveling it at Hitler's head, by the time he straightened his arm, he'd already be dead. So he had to kill him with a bomb. That was the idea. So Hitler was spending most of his time at Rastenburg at this stage. That's in East Prussia, now Poland. That was his command headquarters, trying to organize the fight against the Red Army. They were fighting a losing battle. So the idea was to kill Hitler. Because of the Führer principle, so much of the government was based around one person. And if he was killed, well, then there was no point in being loyal to Hitler. And then a moderate government could take over and make peace with the Allies, both East and West. Anyway, so Stauffenberg, he was in touch with army officers in several different cities, not just in Germany, but in occupied cities such as Paris and Brussels. Now, this is the dilemma that the conspirators faced. They wanted to have a lot of people in on the plot because then they had a good chance of succeeding because it would go ahead, orders would be given, key installations would be seized, and so forth. On the other hand, the more people they informed of the plot, the greater the risk was that one of them would, say, inform the Gestapo, they'd all be arrested and executed. Anyway, so they had to sound people out and hint to people, what do you think of the direction of the war? Are you entirely satisfied with Hitler's leadership, and so forth? So, July 1944, the plot was to go ahead. Stauffenberg, he went to Rastenburg, the Wolf's Lair, as Hitler liked to call it, in East Prussia. He went into a meeting with Hitler. He had a bomb in a bag, and Hitler was being shown some maps on the table. So Stauffenberg had primed his bomb in the lavatory and put it on the floor just in front of Hitler, and then said, "Excuse me, I need to go make a phone call." No mobile phones in those days. So he went out, and a couple of minutes later, the bomb went off as he timed it. However, the bomb had been in Hitler's way, so he kicked it under the table, the bag. It did kill 3 other people in the room. It broke Hitler's arm, left him temporarily deafened in one ear. So that was that. And people initially thought they'd just been hit by an enemy bomb because this sort of thing was happening all the time. For a while, people were so disoriented, nobody connected the fact that Stauffenberg had left the room and a couple of minutes later the bomb had gone off. People had been engrossed in this briefing. So Stauffenberg assumed Hitler had been killed, had to get out of the compound. There were double gates. First of all, the SS guards didn't want to let him out. He said, right, well, I'll make a phone call to HQ, see whether they have permission to leave. And he made the phone call himself and lied. He wasn't given no permission to leave. Anyway, he got to the airfield and flew back to Berlin, landed in Berlin, thinking the coup could go ahead. But it turned out that Hitler was not dead. Hitler broadcast on the radio, yes, I am alive. So had Hitler been killed, would the plot have succeeded? Again, I have my doubts, but there would have been some fighting. So someone like Goebbels would have taken over, because by that stage, Hitler rarely left Rastenburg or indeed Obersalzberg, and Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, seemed to be the face of the Third Reich. He was the one traveling around Germany trying to drum up support for the war effort. So Stauffenberg was arrested at his office, the old Ministry of Defense buildings, and he was executed almost immediately by firing squad. But as people said of this officer who had Stauffenberg killed, you were in a hurry to get your witnesses underground. This officer was also being kept abreast of the plot. He wanted Stauffenberg dead, so that issue was resolved, but also Stauffenberg couldn't spill the beans on him. Anyway, lots of people were arrested and tortured, and in the end over 6,000 people were executed in relation to this plot. I don't think that many were involved, because the conspirators could not afford to bring that many people in on what they were trying to do. Their wives and children were sent to concentration camps, and it was a staggering fall for grace for many of them who'd lived in some opulence because they'd been amongst the upper echelons of the Third Reich. So that was that. There were no significant plots after that. Anyone who might even be a plotter had been killed. Konrad Adenauer was arrested at this time, though he was not part of the conspiracy. Former mayor of Cologne, but also briefly been imprisoned in 1934. And he was a broadly conservative figure, heard muttering against Hitler. He's the man who was the Chancellor of West Germany after the Second World War. So the plotters, though they were traditionalist in outlook, they hoped to form a coalition with people of all points of view, including communists, and then be able to negotiate peace with the Allies. The thing is, the Allies were insisting on unconditional surrender. The plotters were much keener on surrendering to the British, the Americans, even the French, because they hadn't committed so many atrocities in the West and felt they would not be so severely punished. But the Western Allies were wary of negotiating with these conspirators because they thought the Soviets will catch wind of this. The Soviets always think we're trying to leave them in the lurch, sign a separate peace, pull out of the war, and let the Soviets to fight on. So you mustn't do this. Anyway, so that's why it didn't happen. Goebbels, was he even kept apprised of the plot? Because he kept a diary for the war every day, and the page for that day is missing, like he ripped it out. And he was heard to say, if only I was the Führer. So the resistance groups did talk to each other by this stage, the reactionary ones and even the communist ones. Some of the reactionaries had fantasies of restoring the Kaiser. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So the resistance failed for many reasons. It was divided, it had no unifying figure, it couldn't do, you'd be killed. There was no government in exile as such. The different groups had radically dissimilar visions for a post-war Germany. It could be restored Hohenzollern absolute monarchy, as I said, anything to Soviet-style proletarian dictatorship. So they found it impossible to work in concert. So about 10% of German adults were incarcerated at some point during the regime. So, by no means all for resistance, sometimes just belonging to a persecuted ethnic or religious minority, and sometimes just for ordinary crime, like being a pickpocket or something. So the resistance wasn't that popular. The Gestapo was fairly effective, and there was state terror as well as propaganda to keep people believing in the regime. Now, this became less effectual towards the end. The slogans were jaded. They rang hollow. There was a song released in 1943, "A Miracle Will Happen," because that was Germany's only prayer of winning the war, these wonder weapons. The V1, V2, and V3, it stands for Vengeance Weapon. First of all, it's a plane packed with explosives, no pilots, launched to the United Kingdom, later their rockets and so on. but that wasn't enough to turn around the war.